Okay,
Yeah,
great.
sorry. If that's
And
okay.
as for questions, you'll leave some time at the end for questions. I've given you a couple questions from participants ahead of time. And also, if there's any questions or comments from people during your talk, they can drop them in the chat and I'll try to pick them up as best I can. And Bill, just for you to know, there's members of our region online with you today from Brockville, Ottawa, Kingston, Sudbury, and maybe even Timmins. And we've also extended the invitation to pastoral care ministers in the Archdiocese of Kingston. So welcome. It's an honor to have you with us, and thank you very much. We're looking forward to your talk, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you to all of you for giving me this opportunity to spend some time with you. And please know that, that you are the experts in the area of spirituality and narrative, whether you use that term or not. And I'm just kind of an egghead academic that has been playing with some of these ideas for some time. And I'm happy to share them with you as some touchstones or reference points to assist you in some way, or perhaps enrich your own work. But so I'm plugging Robert's book here, as you can see on my first slide. Everybody sees the slide okay? Good. So his wonderful book, How to Be an Even Better Listener. And I couldn't resist pulling a quotation from one of the people that Robert has visited in the palliative unit or hospice context. And it's from someone pseudonymed Manny, who said to Robert in conversation, at 92, all I am is stories. So that's kind of an inspirational jumping off point for what I want to share with you today. I like quotations, and sometimes quotations can set the tone. So this first one is from a well-known narrative psychologist named Donald Polkinghorne, who wrote a book called Narrative Knowing in the Human Sciences, kind of a foundational text in the field of narrative psychology. And he says, we are in the middle of our stories and cannot be sure how they will end. We're constantly having to revise the plot as new events are added to our lives. Another favorite quote is from Alex Haley, author of the best-selling book Roots, which he said once in conversation in an interview, every time an old person dies, it's like a library burns down. Janet Ruffing is an expert in the field of spiritual direction and narrative. This is from her book, To Tell the Sacred Tale. She says, it matters how we tell the story. So I guess it'd be helpful to state what my objectives are with you folks today, to introduce you to some ideas that I work with as a narrative gerontologist. And we'll be touching on a number of these terms like narrative challenges, narrative tasks, narrative foreclosure, narrative environment. And I kind of want to propose that a narrative perspective on spirituality and aging, or I want to propose that as far as the link between spirituality and aging is concerned, narrative can provide a kind of a conceptual bridge, at least in my experience. And I was a pastor with the United Church of Canada for some 10 years before getting into the academic world. And to provide you with some conceptual language and a sort of framework that I think does link spiritual care to narrative medicine on the one hand, and narrative psychology on the other. And maybe to suggest that we envision spiritual care, however we define that, certainly with older adults, as narrative care. And I can make these PowerPoint slides available as we go, or after we're done. So I have two parts. Part one is a quick run through of three big topics: aging, spirituality, spirituality and narrative, narrative and aging. And you can see that they're kind of linked in a Venn diagram sort of way, at least in my mind. So the first piece of the pie that I'd like to chat about with you is aging and spirituality. It's been said by gerontologist Rick Moody that aging is like a natural monastery. Aging has been referred by some in the field of so-called transpersonal gerontology as implicitly spiritualizing, new word for me. research does suggest that older adults who participate in spiritual practices or religious activities, they actually tend to live healthier, longer, and maybe happier lives. And in terms of things like their blood pressure, their cortisol levels, social support systems, etc. Not in all cases, obviously, but that's the general kind of trend. These are some books that many of you may already be aware of anyway, that link aging with spirituality. One of my favorites is called From Aging to Saging by Rabbi Shachter Shalomi. I'll say a little bit more about some of his thoughts later on. Thomas More, who has written a book called Ageless Soul, in his initially best-selling book, Care of the Soul, writes, growing old is one of the ways that the soul nudges itself into attention to the spiritual aspect of life. So we'll start there. Ways in which I think aging nudges us, not forces us, but nudges us to become more down to earth. I mean, literally, we get shorter as we get older. And maybe on some level more grateful. My mother, 99 years of age, lives in a retirement home. And she said to me one day, she said, I feel like I'm already halfway in heaven. Oh, yeah, because I feel like I'm surrounded by so many angels, by whom she meant friends that she talks to on the phone, family members, but also the care providers in the institution where she works, where she lives. I think aging nudges us to become more farsighted, again, literally, because we typically become better at seeing things at a distance than up close. I was trying to read the instructions on a pill bottle earlier today, and this print is so darn small. I don't know who they make that for. Aging nudges us to tolerate paradox, ambiguity, the gray areas of life. This is called capacity for post-formal thought in the psychology of aging. Typically, aging nudges us to control our emotions better, to regulate our emotions, and not be so buffeted about by the sturm and drang of childhood and teenagehood and so forth. To lighten up and maybe to look at life and experience life in a gently ironic way, and to see the positive more than the negatives. This is not true in all cases with older adults, but that tends to be the trend. Positivity bias, it's referred to. I'm in the process of selling my house, so I'm big into decluttering. But there is a sense in which, as we get older, there is a move in us to lighten up, to let go, to declutter, and to focus on what and who in our life matters, to turn inward and to nurture an inner life, and possibly to grow into the role of spiritual elder, which is where Shachter Shalomi's work comes in. I should just go back to my mom for a second, if you don't mind. One of the things about mother that is so special, she's 99, she'll be 100 in November. Hopefully we'll still be able to have some kind of party. She loves hugs. She thrives on hugs. And here we are at Sobeys grocery store, and she's getting a hug from one of her favorite checkout people, Cindy. At night, in the evening, before she turns the light out, after she's in bed, she makes phone calls. And she has a soldier-like commitment to that. She has about 115 people on her list that she regularly calls, on average about 10 to 20 per night, just to check in, see how they're doing, hear about their lives and so forth, and to tell them that she loves them. So I think that's pretty special. She can't see where it means, but she can see the numbers on the phone, and she remembers a lot of phone numbers by heart. Maybe not Ontario ones, because they have an extra 3 digits to remember. So spirituality and narrative will be the next chunk of the pie in part 1. It's been said in a book called Communion of Sinners that the very act of storytelling is by definition holy. We tell stories because they save us. I'm going to guess that you folks know the truth of that more than I can possibly imagine. To enter another's life story is to enter a holy space. This is from Karen Scheib, who might be someone of interest to involved in your grand round sometimes. She teaches pastoral theology, or did, at Emory University in Atlanta. And then Robert Atkinson's wonderful book, The Gift of Stories. He writes, in your stories where you'll find your truth. So the link between spirituality and narrative, I think, is interesting to explore. But spirituality, admittedly, is a complex matter. I think of it as broader than religion. Could say more about that. But spirituality, I see as related instinctively to meaning making, particularly to existential meaning making. And insofar as it's about meaning making, then there's a narrative component, because narrative is one of the key means in which we human beings make meaning, as opposed to the squirrels that come to my bird feeder and rate it religiously. I don't know that they spend a lot of time telling stories to one another and making sense of their day in that respect. But the previous quotes suggest that storytelling itself has an implicitly spiritual dimension, spiritual, broadly defined. Also, that we experience spirituality when we go to the synagogue, the temple, the mosque, the church, whatever. We experience what's being said from the pulpit or being communicated in hymns or prayers, not despite our own stories, but in some level through our own stories. So spiritual development, to me, is closely linked to autobiographical development. And spiritual traditions, whatever they may be, provide us what I call narrative environments to live within, or meta-narratives, or master narratives to live by. These master, I don't like the word meta-narrative, shall we say, that spiritual traditions are the vehicle for. They kind of get absorbed into our system by osmosis, into our narrative unconscious, as my friend Mark Freeman refers to it. And they can be positive or negative, astonishing resources, or for some people at some time in their lives, imprisoning structures. Positive or negative, they are structures for meaning, for morality, for coherence, and they offer us sort of ready-made answers to the perennial questions of why we're here, where we're going. They provide what could be called narrative templates or narrative resources that we can adopt and adapt for thinking about life, the universe, and everything, to use that phrase from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And they offer us kind of overarching accounts of ourselves and of our world, or of ourselves in the world, or a worldview. Something I'll add here, and I do write about it in the book, In Our Stories Lies Our Strength, is that from a narrative perspective, we could think of our own life stories, I'll get to what life stories is about, as sacred texts or even parables that it behooves us to read. One of the books I've written with my colleague, Beth McKim, is called Reading Our Lives, The Poetics of Growing Old. But this quote is from the theologian Frederick Buechner. Let us read with open minds the book our life is writing, and learn. So I say more about the parabolic dimension of our life stories in the book, but briefly, you could think of our own life story, which we're in the middle of as we are going along, as parabolic in the sense that the more deeply we read our lives, the more its meaning kind of exceeds us. And we find as parables, whether we're talking about the parables of Jesus or of the Sufis or whatever, there's always more in those stories that we can mine for meaning and insight. So our own life story, it's the meaning, shall we say, in our life stories is indeterminate and open-ended. And here's a quote from my friend and colleague, Mark Freeman, whose book I recommend, Hindsight. But he writes in one place, our lives, he says, are like richly ambiguous texts to be interpreted and understood, whose meanings are inexhaustible, whose mysterious existence ceaselessly calls forth the desire to know, whose meanings cannot ever yield a final closure. I find that quite stimulating. The third piece of the pie in part one is narrative and aging. Narrative, in my experience, and I've been working in this area for 30 years or more, has made an impact, narrative ideas, narrative perspectives, made an impact on a number of disciplines beyond psychology and gerontology, including theology and ethics and medicine. We'll talk a little bit more about narrative medicine later, and education, etc. These are some book covers that illustrate what I'm talking about. But from a narrative psychology perspective, a narrative gerontology for me is rooted quite significantly in the thinking that's been done within the subfield called narrative psychology. We understand who we are not in terms of statistics, our blood pressure, our white blood count, our glomerular filtration rate, but in terms of stories. And this reminds me of Manny's comment, at 92, all I am is stories. Dan McAdams, a well-known narrative psychologist, defines identity, which is Erik Erikson's term initially, as identity is a life story, an internalized and evolving narrative, some places he says myth or guiding fiction, that provides a life with a sense of unity, meaning, and purpose. But that identity narrative connection is pretty complicated. I had a student in my narrative gerontology course say to me once, gee, there's nothing simple about a life story. I thought that was quite wise, because as one person writes, there are many stories of self to tell and many selves to tell them. Also, there are gendered patterns at work in how we story our lives, and there are a number of researchers that are exploring this. You may have experienced this in your listening to the stories of male patients versus female patients. Our stories are entwined with others. I mean, I can't tell my own story without telling my sister Carol and Donna's stories, my mother and father's. And if you're part of a couple, it's kind of hard to say where your story begins and your partner's ends. And you develop we stories between you. And of course, as the field of narrative therapy would suggest, our stories don't always work for us. They can become problematic, problem saturated, dysfunctional in some way or another, or stunted. And I'll say more about that shortly. Either way, the identity narrative connection and the identity narrative development, I believe, continues into later life. This is a bit repetitive, but so a narrative approach to human development and to aging sees human beings as hermeneutical beings. Again, we're makers of meaning. That's a distinctive dimension of how we function on this planet. And narrative is a key means, not the only means, but a key means of making meaning, And some would say that the narrative impulse is hardwired into us. Someone has coined the phrase homo narrans. We're forever storying the stuff of our lives, not all of it. Of course, a lot of stuff goes beneath the bridge and never gets into a story that we could tell. And I like to suggest that autobiographical memories are often anomalies. They're the things we have memories around things that we, for some reason, can't forget. We don't remember all the times that we went to the dentist, but we do remember that one time that the dentist didn't put enough Novocaine in there and struck a nerve, and it did not feel very good. Okay, I like to say that autobiographical memory is a matter of faction, a blend of fact and fictionalization. Certainly, our life narratives are embodied. Our bodies are living history books, as Carolyn Miss and Anton Boysen talks about living human documents. Another point I wanted to, each of us, I think, is living in our own story world with our own distinct storying style. I could say more about that, and maybe I will later on. But these are some of the books that are out these days in the field of gerontology, where the link between aging and narrative is explicitly made. So I think a narrative perspective on aging is really a different starting point for thinking about aging than the prevailing sort of paradigm, which is a biomedical one. I was at the doctor's office this morning getting some things checked out, and I became very aware that from my doctor and nurse's perspective, and they're wonderful people, they're more interested in what's going on with my body, and I am too when I'm in the doctor's office. But from a narrative perspective, there's an opportunity to focus more on the inner or the biographical as opposed to the biological dimensions of aging. And that means that I think it provides us a location to envision some of the positive potential of aging that often is overlooked. And that includes meaning, wisdom, and spirituality, and the opportunity to see aging not just as a passive matter of getting old, but of innerly, biographically, autobiographically growing old. For me, I think of our lives as quasi-literary novels that we compose from within over time as, and it's complicated, as author or co-author, narrator, protagonist, editor, and reader, more or less at once. And the texts of novels that we are, become more more novel as we get older, more varied, more layered, more complex. We might look similar on the outside. You know, you see a group of people, older people sitting in an audience somewhere, but on the inside, I think the differences are incredibly great. A narrative perspective can see us as not just one story, and that's a very problematic notion, but in fact, many stories in one of many different types in our library, to use that metaphor that Alex Haley has invoked. There's short stories about what I had for supper last night and what I said to my partner. There's the long story about the first marriage. There are subplots, there are chapters, there's me stories and there's we stories, and so on. There are public stories and there are private stories that we hardly even know how to tell ourselves. There are secret stories and there are what I call signature stories. I can say more about that later if there's time. So the narrative gerontology sees later life itself as increasing our need for meaning and thus for narrative activity. It invites from us more narrative thought than logical thought. And the distinction in narrative thought and logical thought comes to us from the psychologist Jerome Bruner, who made that distinction, and a lot of people have built upon that. There's a strong sense, certainly from gerontologists like Gene Cohen, author of The Mature Mind, that the aging process accelerates the autobiographical impulse within us. It pushes us to not just to tell, but to want to read or explore or ponder our unique stories. That's why Mark Freeman refers to later life as the narrative phase par excellence. And lastly, on this slide, I think that, in my perspective at least, there are some unique developmental tasks and developmental challenges that come with later life that are narrative tasks and challenges. When you're 2 or 3 years of age, your developmental tasks include walking and talking and going to the potty by yourself, okay? But there are still developmental tasks as we get older, even though they don't always get looked at in the textbooks. These are some images, rather stark maybe, but they do kind of set the tone for some of the narrative tasks that I think come with later life. And I'm going to say that these narrative tasks are inner tasks and spiritual tasks. This list is 12, so if you want to think of these as the 12 R's of later life, that's fine. Maybe is helpful. I'm not going to go through all of these, but certainly. Oh, don't know what that was. Certainly the impulse to review our lives. This is classic Erik Erikson, that there is an impulse within us, whether we respond to it or not, to step back from the lives that we've lived thus far and to do some assessing, some accounting, some pondering, some evaluating. That includes reflecting on our lives, remembering, pulling ourselves together narratively. That can help us to achieve what Erikson refers to as ego integration. Reconciling the troubles and the traumas in our lives to our lives overall. Resolving, if we can, regrets, resentments, unfinished business. Repair, making amends, healing psychic bruises. I'm not sure where that phrase comes, maybe from your book, Robert. Revising, I like the quip that apparently makes the rounds in psychiatric or psychiatrist circles. It's never too late to have a happy childhood. I mean, you probably have witnessed this in people with whom you visited, where your listening skills help them to do some revising of the story by which they understand who they have been over the years. Recycling, passing on our stories and wisdom to others, that our stories and wisdom might benefit younger people, children, grandchildren, etc. And reaping, harvesting the hidden meanings and life lessons that lurk in our accumulated experience. I'm going through these very quickly, folks, and I hope we have time to come back to some of them if you're interested. But these are some of the narrative challenges that go along with those narrative tasks. The first one on my list here is narrative loss. In very late life, people can have fewer things, literally fewer things available to them to remind them of who they have been and what their life has been about. Or fewer people left standing in their lives. My mother's 99. Most of the people she calls are younger than her, much younger often. Not that she's bothered by that too much. She accepts that in her stride, that she has outlived most everybody. Narrative disposition is a term coined by my colleague Clive Baldwin here at St. Thomas University, and it refers to what we unknowingly do sometimes, for example, with people who have dementia, because they're unable to tell us their stories in ways that make a lot of sense given their cognitive decline. It can be easy for us, perhaps, or tempting for us to conclude there's no story and therefore no person there anymore, which is, I don't think, accurate. But when sometimes we adopt dear language and how you doing, darling, when we're speaking down to older adults, it could be a way of this. But actually, my mother likes. I asked her, "Do you like it when they call you dear?" "Oh, yes, I do very much so." Fine, your call. Narrative knots. I gave a presentation once in Atlanta, and in the group there was a narrative therapist from Japan who was doing her PhD, and she talked about how many of her clients have what she would call narrative knots that need unraveling, or unnarrated pivotal events that are kind of causing a backlog. And you may have witnessed this in your practice, I'm sure, where you help somebody to untie one of those narrative knots and get their story kind of opened back up again. Narrative disorientation is where we lose the thread, which is a phrase we sometimes hear in dementia circles. Someone who has gone into the hospital and has received a pretty heavy duty diagnosis, like you have cancer and you don't have very long to live, could be thrust into what Arthur Frank calls a chaos narrative. Narrative unsustainability is a phrase that my colleague Karen Scheib has coined. I think there's some merit to that. And narrative, jumping through these, we can come back. Narrative foreclosure is a challenge that I think is particularly, that older adults are particularly vulnerable to. Not only older adults, but, and here's a little cartoon that I've come up with or found that I think illustrates narrative imprisonment. When you're stuck in a story about yourself or your past or your family or whatever, and you can't get out of it. And you want to say to them, well, just let it go, drop it. And it's easier said than done. But narrative foreclosure, again, Mark Freeman, is the premature conviction that one's life story has effectively ended. That's too late simply to live meaningfully. There's little left to do but play out the pre-scripted and often sort of tragic ending. I know that it's possible at any age, when you're 15 and your boyfriend or girlfriend says bye-bye, you can feel an acute case of narrative foreclosure. What's the point of going on? You know, what's that song from the 50s? Why must the world go on turning? You can fill in the blanks. My singing's not very good. But you want to go down to the bridge and jump off, because what's the point? The story is basically over. He's still only 15. So narrative foreclosure is not exclusive to later life. But I think as we get older, we move through retirement, we have health issues, it becomes easier for us to say, well, I guess the story's over. My body is still going through the motions, but for all intents and purposes, the narrative of my life has wound down. Our Dutch colleagues, Ernst Bollmeyer and Herman Westerhoff and others, have done some helpful research to suggest that narrative foreclosure can have significant consequences for mental health in later life, and may be a mediating factor between late life events and depression. Because many of you, I think, work in a medical context, I thought we could play for a second or two here and rephrase some of these narrative challenges that I've just listed in a more medicalized way. And who knows, maybe someday these will become diagnoses that will be part of the medical field. Narrative arrest would be, the story has stopped. The doctor says, 2 months to live, terminal cancer. It would be an acute case of narrative foreclosure. It's been suggested that in some nursing homes, certainly not in Canada, or certainly not in Ontario, that the average resident of a nursing home receives somewhere around 6 minutes of real person-to-person contact per day. If that's the situation you're living in, then your story is going to dry up on some level inside of you, and you may experience what I call narrative atrophy. Narrative anemia is when there's a thin story, it's weak, it's not very strong. Narrative septicemia, quite proud of this particular term. Your story of your life is filled with what Dan McAdams called contaminated sequences and toxic stories. And there needs to be a narrative detoxification process. Narrative indigestion would be the experiences, perhaps heavy duty ones, that haven't been digested, haven't been sorted out. Narrative constipation would be, there's an untold story in there that's really important, and you as a listener can sense that, but the individual, him or herself, can't get the story out. Narrative compaction is a severe case of that. You got to dig really to get the story out. Narrative diarrhea would be the opposite. There's a story flowing, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of substance to it. Sorry if I seem a bit irreverent. And narrative pregnancy would be, there's a new story waiting to be told once the right midwife person comes along to hear that into being. I'm going to move quickly because I'm conscious of time, and we're not going to get through everything in these slides. And I do want Robert to say time to stop so we can chat. But I want to just touch on some other concepts that I work with and that you may find of interest and value in your own work. Narrative environment, narrative medicine, which you've heard of, I'm sure, narrative care, and narrative self-care. So we don't story our lives in isolation, but within a web of social contexts that we're forever moving in and out of, and they are intertwined themselves. The family of origin that we're brought up in, the community that we live in, the church or religious organization that we're part of, the profession that we're part of, marriages that we're part of, friendships, relationships, including therapeutic relationships. So the number of larger stories, as I call them, which constitute the narrative environment, very complex thing of our lives. And each narrative environment, I would suggest, has its unique rules for telling and listening, for language to be used, scripts by which to understand oneself. If you're, for example, trained to be a lawyer and you really identify closely with the lawyer role and the lawyering profession, then there's perhaps some built-in scripts that come with that profession for how to make sense of your life and to view the world, etc. Narrative environments can be large and vast, like entire religious systems or political systems, or they can be micro, the relationship you have with your best friend. That's its own distinct narrative environment, I would suggest. And narrative environments can be positive, negative, open, closed, flexible, rich, rigid, thick, bleak, like the nursing homes that I referred to earlier, inviting or inhibiting of our narrative development, de-storying or restorying. So to get to a hospital context here, and this is the Fredericton Hospital pictured above, entering a hospital or a nursing home as a patient is definitely a change in one's narrative environment. And so it's on some level a restorying experience. We have to revise the plot, to go back to that initial quote, a little or a lot. And that shift in narrative environment, depending upon our diagnosis and the duration of our stay, presents narrative challenges that are real. At best, the time that we spend is just one short chapter in our overall story. Other chapters will follow. It's not the whole story. Or at worst, it's a de-storying experience. And we sense that our identity has somehow gotten reduced to a set of symptoms or a diagnosis or a label. Maybe we'll hear good-hearted staff, making reference to us, in at the outside of our door as the gallbladder in 13B, or the feed in 102, or the horrible term that we have sometimes in our media here in the Maritimes, a bed blocker. So obviously healthcare settings have their stories too. But I'm sitting here on the outside, but the language and the exchanges within them tend, understandably, to be dominated by a biomedical master narrative, where people are patients first and persons second. Logical thought, if you like, trumps narrative. I'm not sure if we can use that word trump in that sense now, but that's the original way in which it was used, I think, in the OED. And you as spiritual care providers, I'm guessing, could feel sometimes like round pegs in a world of square holes, champions of and experts in narrative thought in a world that's dominated by logical thought. Maybe like odd ducks. I don't know. I've certainly felt like an odd duck when I was doing chaplaincy rounds as a minister here in Fredericton years ago. So from Rita Sharon's book, Narrative Medicine, patient-centered care seeks an integrated understanding of the patient's world, their whole person, emotional needs, and life issues. I love how she brings in her own self a medical degree and a PhD in English literature in her masterful book, Narrative Medicine, Honoring the Stories of Illness. But for me, the patient's world is their unique story world. Their stories are central to their identities, emotions, values, beliefs, and to their health. Our patients understand who they are, not in terms of, as I say, white blood count measures or body mass index or bone mass density, etc., but in terms of stories, in terms of biography and not biology. Here we have medical doctor Oliver Sacks saying to us in his book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, biologically, physiologically, we are not so different from each other, but historically, as narratives, we are each of us unique or novel, as I like to say. So in a narrative medicine context, caring for patients' stories really is as vital as caring for their bodies. And we can sense their stories in their bodily gestures and postures because our stories are, after all, embodied. And I don't know, but I'm guessing that you could say if patients sense that you're not interested in who they are, but only in what's wrong with them, particularly with their bodies, they can become impatient, non-compliant, withdrawn, cranky, depressed, or whatever. So the question is, how can the kinds of settings in which many of you work be helped to become more restoring versus destoring so that folks can meet the narrative challenges as well as the medical challenges that they face? And my answer simply is through some form of narrative care. And again, I'm suggesting that spiritual care and narrative care are extremely close cousins. One of the early voices in the field of narrative medicine was Dr. Arthur Kleinman, who says in one place, few of the tragedies at life's end are as rending to the clinician as that of the frail patient who has no one to tell their life story to. And then Sam Keane and Ann Valley Fox, you can't tell who you are unless someone is listening. So the listening. So the people in our care, in hospitals, nursing homes, and other healthcare contexts are dealing not just with medical issues, but with narrative issues as well. Their story and thus their identity can be and often is threatened in one way in a disjointed, disoriented, dominated, shattered, shut down, rendered chaotic, prematurely foreclosed, and I would suggest in need of people like yourselves to help reopen, to restory, and to strengthen their stories. So I think of narrative care as story listening, as attending to, and maybe as importantly, as for the stories by which people understand who they are. I wrote a book once called The Stories We Are, and I still stand by that title, that we can't separate ourselves from the stories by which we understand who we are. And I'm borrowing a word from Robert's book. Narrative care is the subtle, sensitive, and he says nimble art of close reading of people's stories. And I can imagine that it's engaging, it's exhausting, and it's rewarding all at once. Narrative care is about attitude as much as activity. It's about empathy more than sympathy. It's about quality of connection as much as it is quantity of time. When my mother gets a 10-second hug by someone who stepped outside the COVID protocol and said, Emma, I want to give you a hug, then that's 10 seconds of that lasts mother the rest of the day. And she calls me and says, oh, I got the most wonderful hug from Debbie. And she sets her in a wonderful mood for the rest of her day. So narrative care is about helping people to tell their stories in ways that make them stronger, and I would suggest more resilient. We've been doing some work, the team and I here at St. Thomas, on narrative resilience in later life. Narrative care can be very informal, from, quote, just listening, and I don't like the word just in front of listening, to therapy per se. It can be adapted to different contexts, from palliative care to long-term care to ER, etc. It can be practiced between the lines of other activities. Wheeling an older person to lunch is an opportunity to exude and express narrative care, or taking them to an X-ray. Another person who kind of pointed the way towards what we now call narrative medicine is the medical doctor and psychiatrist Robert Coles in his book, The Call of Stories. And this would be, I think, the sort of thing that Robert Mundell is addressing wonderfully in his book, how to be an even better listener. Um, Robert Coles, when he was going through Massachusetts General Hospital in his residency to be a psychiatrist, he had two mentors, one of whom was all about getting out there and as quickly as you could coming up with a tentative diagnosis for patient A, B, or C. The other mentor he had, an older psychiatrist, said, well, I think you should listen to the story and have a conversation. And so Coles writes, he urged me to be a good listener in the special way that a story requires. Note the manner of presentation, the development of plot, character, the addition of dramatic sequences, the emphasis according to one figure or another in the recitation or the recital, and the degree of enthusiasm, of coherence that the narrator gives to his or her account. This could take some time, and I don't know that we have very much time left. But I think a lot of these things that one can listen for in practicing narrative care are instinctive for you folks. Insofar as you get this idea that people and their stories are inseparable. So you're listening for the recurring phrases, the recurring themes, the recurring metaphors that the person uses in what they say, the key plot lines and subplot lines and chapters that they're sort of alluding to when they tell you about their life and they engage in some sort of life review with you as the listener. The kind of reminiscence, there are different types of reminiscence. The storying style. I realized years ago that my father had a storying style where he would characteristically position himself as the smart kid in in the squabbles that would take place in the schoolyard growing up as a kid back in Nova Scotia. He wasn't bragging about how he always knew what had to be done, but that was a traditional a typical sort of way in which Dad told stories about his life. And I realized at the same time that my storying style is very different. I tell dumb stories about myself. I tell stories on myself that make me look kind of silly and stupid. And I'm not sure why that is the case. One of you could probably help me with that. But I think each person has, as you listen, a distinctive sort of storying style or narrative tone. Some people tend towards the tragic genre, and you can hear it in their tone of voice. Degrees of narrative agency, the kinds of signature stories that they may trot out to you. The larger stories or narratives that they appear to be rooted in and how those have shaped their individual narratives. And the incipient restoryings or sacred stories that are waiting to be told. So kind of getting close to summing up here, narrative care involves fostering spaces where folks can step back from and think of their lives as stories. And in my experience with students who may only be 20 or 22, but invite them to think of their lives as stories that they're in the middle of with different chapters, and it lightens them up and helps to give them some affectionate detachment on stuff that has otherwise been pretty heavy and hard in their young lives. Narrative care maybe involves helping people to identify and start to address some of the outstanding narrative tasks and challenges that they face, to air long buried or risky stories. I know when you hear someone say, I've never told this to anyone before, but I mean, that's sacred ground and very important ground. I'm sure you can attest to that from your work. Narrative care involves fostering spaces where folks can draw new life from old stories, can test out new stories, and overall can keep their stories open and can keep growing old, as I like to say, rather than just passively getting old. So I'm going to suggest that narrative care, which I'm also saying is spiritual care, is really an adventure in stories, where you're on the frontier of people's storying and restorying processes, maybe where the requisite sort of frame of mind to bring to that is a beginner's mind. And here's a quote that Robert has in his book from Heather Meyerand: to enter a patient's room, and I put in older patient's room or home, for the first time is like walking into a long, complicated story that one understands nothing about. A story that's reaching its final crisis. Now, older adults may or may not be palliative per se, but generally they're nearer the end of their life than they are the beginning of their life. And so they're more aware of their mortality. So there are a number of things that I think you could suggest narrative care involves with those who are dying. But Robert, I'm very conscious of the time, and I don't want to hog too much more of it because I hope we can have some time for conversation. I think we lost it.
Yeah, it sounds good, Bill. Are there any questions? People can just jump in and ask, and I'm going to check if there's anything in the chat here.
I'm sorry if
Brenda, go ahead.
I say I'm sorry if I throw out more than we possibly have time for, but I get so excited about these topics, as you can probably tell, and there's so many rabbit holes that you can wander down when you start looking at aging and spirituality from a narrative perspective. Well, if there are no, I know there's a couple of, okay.
Sorry, there were a couple of questions I sent ahead of time. Did you get a chance to
Yes.
think about those? Okay.
Yeah, one was from Anne. It was about how I got interested in narrative in the first place. Well, I could say, but I was born at a very young age, which is very common here in New Brunswick. But my father was a preacher, and he was a natural raconteur. He could tell a story quite amusing and riveting about just about anything. And I think I grew up in a household where storytelling was prized. His storytelling, that is, not so much ours as kids. But the Maritime Provinces, maybe you could argue, has a particularly lively narrative environment. People are often valued and prized in some communities because they're good storytellers, and they're good to have at the party because they're entertaining and they have a wonderful way of taking the stuff of their lives or the stuff of the community and making it into a very listenable. So I think I grew up with an interest in stories. I read a lot because I missed a lot of time due to sickness as a kid. So I read a lot of Hardy Boys books. And anyway, when I became a minister myself some years later, I realized quite quickly that the big part of my work, apart from Sundays and other meetings and so forth, was listening to people's stories, trying to crawl inside their worlds. And how do you do that? But you ask them to tell me about yourself, tell me about your family. And then when I got to divinity school, I realized that back in the 70s, there was something being called narrative theology, which really caught my attention. And I embarked upon some graduate studies in that area, but had to abort them and went into the parish ministry. But when I decided to go back to University of Toronto, OISE, and I was admitted to a doctoral program, I realized, all that stuff that I was interested in earlier about narrative and narrative theology and stories, I wonder if I could whip that into some kind of a thesis. And thankfully, I had some good direction, and it resulted in a book called The Stories We Are, an essay on self-creation. And that book is still one that I mine for ideas and has led me, thankfully, into the field of narrative gerontology, which I didn't have a background in prior to starting to work at St. Thomas. So don't tell anybody, but I'd never taken, let alone taught a course in gerontology before coming to St. Thomas. But we learn on the job, don't we? So that's a brief answer to Anne's question about how I got into this whole story thing. There's more to it than that. And David had a question about something I refer to in our Stories Lies Our Strength book, a program at a local nursing home here in Fredericton called Celebrating Our Stories. And that's one of the more formal or more Cadillac versions of narrative care, as I like to call it, because it's quite labor intensive, but it's also extremely valuable in terms of enriching the environment and the climate of the nursing home and where such a program is practiced. And in the program, individual older adults are selected and are interviewed at length using something called Life Bio, which is a book and a website. It has just a bunch of basic questions to elicit people's stories about their life from childhood through to adulthood and so forth, their careers, their families, their marriages, etc. And after a number of such interviews, the residents' answers are written up in a book form and presented to them at a public ceremony in the nursing home. But the book of their life, and I've known some residents who are so proud of that they'll carry that book around in their walker with them ever after. But there's a video that's done of their life featuring photographs from various parts of their life, some of their favorite, some of the sayings that they or some of the things that they said in the interviews, and some of their favorite pieces of music. So for 15, 20 minutes, the audience at these ceremonies is regaled with a kind of a glimpse, multimedia glimpse of that individual's life, whom otherwise we might say, oh, well, that's just Mary or John, and he's kind of out of it or whatever. But for that time, that afternoon, that person comes alive for everybody, staff, volunteers, even family members, and others who attend, as, oh my gosh, all the things that they've done, all that they went through, all that they accomplished, and so forth. And never a dry eye in the audience at those events. So that's what Celebrating Our Stories is about. And you could find out more about that in a book that some of us edited called Storying Later Life, Issues, Investigations, and Interventions in Narrative Gerontology. But there are many. We have a program that's being launched here at through our university called Train the Trainer program in narrative care. And we are equipping people who are perhaps nurses or OTs or PTs or social workers working in various contexts. We're equipping them with the basics of, shall we say, narrative care, so that they can go out and train others. And we hope that there'll be like a ripple effect throughout our region. Because there is quite a bit of interest in our region in narrative ideas. And we find a lot of life writing groups popping up here and there. And I get asked to speak to such groups on a fairly regular occasion. So that, I hope, helps you understand a bit about the Celebrating Our Stories version of narrative care. I do have a slide up here about things you already know insofar as you work in the field of palliative care and hospice, is that, from a narrative perspective, there are certain kinds of things, shall we say, to be considered when you're working with or being with those who are dying. And one of the bullets there is people may prefer to tell nostalgic stories of their past. I had a wonderful Skype conversation or Zoom conversation yesterday with Odger Sinus, who is pronounced sinus as in the nose, okay, but it's different spelling. He's based in Oslo, Norway, and he's a narrative gerontologist who wrote a wonderful article about the role of nostalgic stories with people who are palliative, because he has done a lot of work in palliative care. And where rather than sort of engage in a very in-depth sort of life review, which is quite labor intensive for the older adult, the individual preferred to tell sweet, sort of pleasant stories about happy times in their life that, in a sense, kind of gave you a glimpse into the best of their experience of being who they are. Like, oh, it was so wonderful when we were little children to go and in the fields overlooking the fjords with the family on the Sunday afternoon. I remember that, and how the flowers would dance in the breeze. So we might dismiss such stories as, well, there's no real substance there, but Odger Sinus has said, no, there's a lot of identity symbols that can be at work in those kinds of simple, poignant stories that people might like to tell near the end of life. But again, this is your territory more so than it is mine by a long shot.
Any other questions from participants?
I have a question. Hi, this is Janita from Kingston. I don't have a question, but I do want to say this is so much of our work, and yet to hear you give this presentation and talk about all the others, just really, it's enlivening. And so I really want to thank you very much. My dad wrote his memoirs when he finished them when he was 80, and he's almost 92 now, and he's blind now. And so the women who care for him and we ourselves, we read his stories to him. And he never wrote this for himself, but as it turns out, this is something that's really helping him now, because it's helping him to remember all these things. Storytelling's just so important. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
I'm touched by your story about your dad and him writing his memoir at 80 and now being in his 90s. It's a similar situation as my own father. Okay. And that to read back to someone stories that they have written about themselves when they're 10 years further down the line can reignite their sense of agency and worth and value and meaning. And yes, I have lived a good life. Because sometimes when you're by yourself in a institutional room, you can feel that your story kind of dries up, as I suggest, within you. And this reading back to someone the stories of their lives can be such an enlivening gift, for sure.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. He also is in the habit of phoning people all over the world, and that's what keeps him going. At one of the things, yeah, just like your mom.
Yeah, it's like for mom, it's like a personal mission almost, not in a religious sense, but
No,
you know, but she's kind of creating her own social support network. She's proactively, I mean, she can't see because of macular degeneration,
yeah,
but she can still talk
yeah.
and listen.
I think it's a way of having purpose in your life as well. Yeah.
Yeah, there's an old hymn that mother likes to remind herself of. You know, I was in a museum, the Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta, and there was a special room devoted to the personal effects of Martin Luther King Jr. And underneath this glass case, in his own handwriting, were the words of this song. So I'm going to tear up. If I can help somebody, if I can help somebody as I travel along, if I can cheer somebody with a word or song, then my living will not be in vain. And mother takes that to heart, not as a religious kind of mission, but as you say, it gives her life tremendous purpose.
Yeah.
Gets her up in the morning.
Yeah. Thank you.
This wonderful quotation from Christina Baldwin. I'm not sure if you know this book, Story Catcher, The Power of Story to Change Our Lives. I see what the work that many of you do as story catching and also being story companions, which is Karen Scheib's term. Practice of narrative pastoral care invites us to become story companions to one another. So it's not just a one-way street, because I'm guessing that as you listen, there is a certain amount of sharing that you may do with the older adult or the patient that you're talking with. And there is a kind of a merging, a meshing. And on some level, I think you may have felt that you have become, not because you've tried to become, but have become an important character in that individual's life in their final chapters, and maybe help them to co-author a deepened, stronger story that they can carry with them about who they are.
Bill, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
There's something I've been thinking about that, just in the moment I might term something like narrative alienation. Like someone said to me years ago, they were telling me a story, and he said to me, it happened so long ago, it's not true anymore. It's like the memory is so distant, it's just not, it just doesn't seem real or true. And I find as I'm aging, and I think back on things that I did, let's say in my 20s, I kind of struggle to remember them as actually happening to me. And I feel kind of alienated from myself, from my own story that doesn't seem true anymore. Have you ever come across that?
Not in that, not with that phrase, but I like that phrase. May I rob that from you, Robert? Narrative alienation, because it's, again, one of those challenges, if you will, that you're right. Because when you reach a certain age, the past seems like a foreign country.
Yeah.
They do things differently there, isn't that the?
Yeah.
But there's the whole question that makes the whole question of truth. What do we mean by truth when it comes to stories? There's an interesting book by a psychoanalyst named Donald Spence, came out in 1982, called Narrative Truth versus Historical Truth. And he asks the question, what is it that the psychoanalyst is up to? Is it to try to help the client or patient sort of recover the historical truth, the facts, and get on a solid ground in terms of what actually happened? Or is it more to not sort of play light with the historical truth question, but to prioritize narrative truth? And you're going to ask me, what do you mean by that? And I don't quite know. And I'm drifting away from your question about feeling alienated from your own past at times. I don't know about you, Robert, but for me, in the last number of years, I've decided to make a chart so I don't forget too much while my memory is still working okay. So I have this chart that I've made with columns, and on the left side there's the years. I might have from 1950 to 1960. So I list all of the people that I knew or can recall knowing in those first 10 years of my life. And then another column would be places that I lived. And then another column might be the kind of general things that I recall doing, like going to church or whatever. And then the specific things that I can actually recall doing, and I have kind of a vivid memory. So this is a way of doing an inventory and maybe helping to overcome some of that sense of narrative alienation that you're referring to.
Yeah, that's a good idea to put it in a chart like that. I like that.
It's a kind of a clunky sort of thing to do, but it is a way of, and I've kind of stopped. I mean, I took the chart up to about the 1990s, and there's so much happened since then that I'm almost overwhelmed, but I really want to do that. And I feel that that would be my personal way of doing some of that life review, and also of sort of strengthening or thickening my own story, which could maybe make me be a better listener to other people's stories.
Yeah, thank you.
Anyway,
Other questions? Bill, I'm also curious as to what motivates you in this kind of field, and I'm curious to know if you've had any transformative experiences of someone really listening to you. Does anything stand out? You know, has it been a rare or special experience for you to have someone listen to you and to feel heard in a way that's different from other regular experiences?
yes, I have. Thank you for asking. And we've had a couple of nice Zoom chats ourselves, Robert, and I got to say you're pretty gifted in that regard yourself. But over the years, things I needed to sort out have gone to see a counselor or whatever. And I've been fortunate to have counselors that really were extremely good listeners, or at least I thought they were really good listeners. And they really tried to crawl inside of my unique story world as best they could. And I would walk away from sessions with such people, not necessarily feeling like I'd solved whatever problem I had gone in with or sorted out whatever the issue was, but I felt better or bigger or stronger somehow in myself. I felt expanded, enlarged in some way because of the kind of listening they did. But you know what? Truth be told, those kinds of experiences are fairly few and far between. I think we have a lot of talk shows in the media, but not many listen shows. And that's a kind of a dumb thing to say, but I think you know what I mean. I have a variety of really good friends, and if I wanted to kind of rate them on just how good each of them is as a listener to me, I might find myself spending more time with these over here rather than those over there. But it's rare, and so if insofar as you folks are the stars and the experts and the groundbreakers in the field of story listening, don't stop. Do not stop. So important. Whether it's valued like it should be, and maybe you don't feel sometimes like a round peg in a world of square holes. Maybe that was just sort of projection on my part, but don't let that get you down, because you're on the frontier of the storying and the restorying process that's so subtle and delicate and central to who a person is and how they're growing. It's somewhere beyond therapy. I'm going to say it's beyond psychoanalysis. It's beyond ministry. I'm not sure what category it falls into, but it's really important. So my little wrap up list here. I often will kind of go through these. So for me, narrative care is not rocket science, and yet that does not mean it's simple. It's anything but simple. It's an intricate, dynamic, delicate, or to use your word, Robert, nimble art, low tech but high impact. I think it's potentially transformative, not only in the life of the person you're listening to, but in your own life as well. Maybe that's part of why you people are hooked on this as a line of work and stay at it. It's regenerative. I think you can help somebody to turn their life and their life story from being an unmitigated tragedy to being an adventure. I don't know how you do that, but I think that's possible. I think narrative care is as vital and as important as dietary care, pharmacare. I think what some people really need, and you've probably sensed this more than I, is not, you know, another pill, but just a good dose of narrative care. It's spiritual care, it's patient-centered care all in one. It's a relationship, it's not a task. It's implicitly therapeutic, I like to say. And it's core care because it goes to the core, as the French would say, or the heart of who a person is and who they're becoming. And it begins at home, which is why I always include a section on narrative self-care, which is no time for today, but the rest of the slides, which I'll happy to send to you to distribute if you'd like, touches on. Really important. Yeah. So I've been trying to offer a framework that comes from this emerging field of narrative psychology and narrative gerontology and narrative medicine, which I'm sure you're aware of anyway, to provide linchpins or connecting points and maybe even a language to further validate what it is that you do. Not that you need that validation necessarily, but sometimes we have a certain, in my experience of working in the field of narrative and planning conferences like Narrative Matters and so forth, people have found that the narrative language or narrative terminology, thinking of life as a story, the root metaphor of life as story, actually opens up a lot of interesting possibilities that otherwise we haven't really known too much about, because narrative psychology is really only about sort of 40, 50 years old, you might say, in terms of people actually writing about it. And if anybody wants to contact me about sources that I might suggest you pursue, I'm happy to do that. Absolutely.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. This has been a wonderful presentation. It's so nice to have you with us, and thank you. Just as a reminder, you've recorded this session, and at some point you can let me know when it's available on your website, and I can forward that information to people and pass along the slides as well and any other materials you might have. And just a final check, if anyone's has a question just before we sign off. Any final questions or comments?
Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anne.
Great. Thank you, Bill. A pleasure.
Take care, folks. Keep up the good work.
All right. Bye-bye.